like, okay, so for students who don't have transfer credits, what is the next thing that best splits that population into high and low retaining groups? So it
Yeah.
kind of gets down to, and then you can see areas where, okay, overall students in this population retain lower, but under these circumstances, we actually find that they retain at higher rate.
I love that because it is what you said, where so often we go to a campus and they're like, oh, we know athletes. Like athletes are our most at-risk population, right? And then you run all of the data and analyze it and say, it's not athletes. It is athletes who play football, who came in with a high school GPA of this, who are this far from home and have this many credit hours, that they're taking right now. And the relief to a practitioner where I'm not having to think of all my athletes as somebody that I have to resource, but instead you've given me this really specialized piece, I think is so helpful. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Season 5, Episode 15 of Cap and Gown. I'm Rachel Phillips-Buck, VP for Student Success, joined this afternoon by our president, Matt Boisvert. Hey, Matt.
Hi, Rachel. Great to see you.
Listen, I have been on 3 weeks of travel.
Yeah.
I was in Atlanta for the CCCU conference, and then I was in Nebraska, which we will talk about, which was a whole experience. And then last week we had spring break. So my daughter and I took a road trip, which was awesome. And so I'm trying to get back in the swing of things. That's how I feel.
Yeah. And before that, we were in Austin. So
yeah, that's right. I feel like I haven't seen Z since then. Like it's been 3 weeks where I'm like, I don't know what's going on around here. But we had Rebecca look up all of our institution's spring breaks. And she was telling me that spring break for our schools goes between the end of February and the middle of April.
Yeah. And for some schools, they don't call it spring break. It's
winter break.
Winter break.
Or mid-semester break. So, yeah. It's been pretty interesting. I'm excited about today because we are going to get to talk. You're not. I'm going to get to talk to Viva Gore, our director of retention intelligence. So I'm so excited to be able to introduce her to everyone and just her very unique way of thinking about things, her very intentional way of thinking about data. That would be fun for us to talk about. But that is our word of the year. And you have a story for us.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, bring in some real stories. So Lucille Ball, we talked about, right? So what are some intentional stories, people that we know in ways that they've kind of changed the world by being intentional? And today I wanted to talk about Oprah Winfrey because we know Oprah and you just watch her and you see, I mean, she's so intentional in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But so if you go back to when she was just a kid, she was intentional. Like she made the decision to leave her family, her mom's home in Milwaukee, to move into her father's house in Nashville. When she was 19, still in college, she became a television station, WTVF, in Nashville. She became the station's youngest and first Black female news anchor at the age of 19.
Wow.
And that's pretty incredible. She then, she just was moving. She had a vision and a goal. She moved to Baltimore, and she moved from news into talk show, which was called People Are Talking. She then goes to Chicago. She was a host of AM Chicago and made it the #1 talk show in Chicago and the highest rated talk program. So, but then you go forward to her establishing Harpo Productions, which is kind of unheard of. So she became the owner of her own show, the head of creative control. She was just remarkable there. But then think about all that she's done with her book club, right?
Oh, yeah.
The other thing that I didn't know is that she formed a partnership with Apple TV. And so she started a partnership with Apple TV in 2018. so that she can focus on streaming platforms. So
interesting. So, I mean, what all of these people that we've talked about so far have in common is their ability to step out of the present, right, and look into the future and be like, this is how I'm going to get to where I want to go. And just to be very innovative about what each of those steps are and how they think about their goal. Pretty amazing.
Yep.
Awesome.
Thanks, Oprah.
Yeah, thanks, Oprah. That's really fun. You get a car and you get a car and how fun would that be?
That would be fun.
So awesome. Replace you now with our Director of Retention Intelligence, Viva Gore. Hey, Viva.
Hi.
You're so kind to agree to do this with me. I know on our team, every time I talk about who our next guest is going to be, I feel like everyone on the team is like, please don't, I'm not ready. Don't pick me. And then I'm always just so enthusiastic about introducing you to all of our listeners so that they know the kind of people that they get to work with. So you're very kind to agree. And you're in London and it's what, like 7:30?
Yeah.
So your day is almost done. After this, you can go put your pajamas on and eat dinner if you want to. So, Viva, I want to set up our conversation. I said you're the Director of Retention Intelligence, but one thing that I think is really important for everyone to know is that Pharos Resources years ago would do unsolved mysteries every Friday. And we took them very seriously. We would like do the case and then everyone had to go and do all the research and we would have an hour to talk through it. And you are the undisputed champion of unsolved mysteries. You always came with like all of this information that we were like, oh, I feel like Viva solved the case then. I don't know what the problem is. But it's a great application just of your data-driven mind to get answers. So that was always fun. We should go back to that. It ended up being so much work for everyone. We're like, we have a lot of work to do otherwise. I don't have hours to try to figure out who murdered that person, you know? So I want to set the stage for retention intelligence. You know, years and years ago, probably 15 years ago, Matt was like, we should do retention intelligence. And we started by giving our schools just a tool. Like, here we have all this data, you can go now and figure it out. And it's really involved under your leadership and direction to something that is so robust, and our schools that use it love it so much. Can you, first of all, just as you think about retention intelligence, what are we talking about there?
So I think retention intelligence is all about actionable insights, looking into the trends of different student populations' retention over time, and also being able to really highlight which students are the most at risk for not retaining.
Yeah, it's such an important distinction. We'll talk a little bit later, but there is like a lot of times schools are like, we have IR. And IR is so much about descriptive, like here's what's happening and here's what we're telling the government. And what you do with Spark, which is a service that I don't provide it, that you provide. Can you tell us, like, what is the deliverable that comes from the Spark service for our clients?
So Spark is reports. We go into all data points that a client would be sending us. So we get a lot of background demographic information from their SIS to our system, and we look at all of that. And we also look at the 360 usage data, so ways that they're identifying students in the system that are at risk. And we highlight to them which populations are at the most at risk on their campus. And then we deliver reports twice a year to kind of check in on that and say, are these risk factors consistent over time? And where have we been able to see improvements, or where if retention's ever down, to say, okay, can we explain that and like really pinpoint what it looks like happened on a campus so that we can start those conversations to better understand what's going on?
Yeah. I think Spark is such a remarkable service because it really is tied to your student population and what you are doing to try to intervene with them, which is really remarkable. You know, we're always talking about our student success funnel, and what you do with Spark is like the identification piece, which we'll talk more about, but it's like on steroids. Like, I'm always saying, if I worked at an institution, I feel like I do the connect and solve really well. I understand that piece, but just having someone give me a target population where I can focus my resources, and then to have somebody do outcome measurements and be like, good job, Rachel, here's the impact you had, or that intervention did not work at all. So stop doing all of that hard work. And we've got to think of something different. I just think it is so powerful for our schools. The other thing that's kind of under the umbrella of retention intelligence is our focus model that you deliver. Can you talk about how that's different than Spark?
Yeah, so for focus, we have to be a bit more strict with clients on the data that they send us. We need a lot of data points because we are training and building a predictive model. So with Spark, we'll look at overall populations that are higher risk, whereas with Focus, the deliverable is for every incoming student. We'll have taken historical data and used that to assign a risk level for that student of how likely the model thinks that they are to retain. So just really focus in support early on as soon as that student comes on campus. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where over the last 15 years, I have seen many iterations of focus with different people trying to deliver that. It's really hard, right? So we have had models way in the past where it's like a 50% accuracy of how at risk, which is like, then just flip a coin for every student. It's not going to be helpful. I think what you've brought to that model is just a level of professionalism and insight where our schools will call back and be like, what have you done? Because we are looking at what you predicted and then what it's looking like for persistence or registration, those sorts of things. And it's just so well thought out and delivered to our schools that I think sometimes it feels like magic. It feels like magic to me for sure. But what we like about it is that you are, again, here's the population and you can decide, do you want to focus your resources in the middle? Do you want to focus your resources on your most at-risk students? How do we improve their persistence and retention by using those resources in a really targeted way? So I love that. So when we think about identifying students, how should institutions think about who they're trying to support beyond just what we all assume are standard risk factors?
Yeah, so I think when we first initially work with a Spark client, that there are often a lot of assumptions that come into it, and it's rewarding to be able to provide the data to say, yes, that's absolutely right, or no, maybe you need to rethink that. Yeah. So I think when you're starting to look at what populations are at risk on campus, you want to think about what data points you have to kind of get a holistic view of a student. So you'll have maybe some demographic factors, like standard ones like gender and race and ethnicity, first generation, what state they were from, maybe distance from home, things that might affect transition. And then you want features that look at academic preparedness, financial background, and involvement at universities. That could be some lagging ones. You might know early on who's going to be in athletics, but maybe Greek system and other ways that a student might be involved on campus. If they're commuting, so like things that really like take in everything and different ways that a student will be interacting on campus. And yeah, I think you want to be able to look at all of them together to see how they interact. So I think I find it really helpful to run a decision tree early on, if that's something people feel capable. Like it's pretty simple, but so it will help like split students into areas of high and low retention, and it's a helpful like direction when you're first starting out thinking about who might be at risk.
So can I just, when you're talking about decision tree, this is the idea that we're looking at, let's just say our freshman population, and then you're looking at something like gender. So then we're splitting it and we're saying, is there a retention difference between males and females? Wow, our females are retaining much lower. So then we're going to focus on this population, and then we're going to add in some other level and say, okay, let's look at their high school GPA and split that apart until we get down to this really specialized population. Is that a fair representation of what you're talking about?
So that is definitely one way that you can approach it if you don't have like the tools to create a decision tree specifically, but a decision tree will take the information gain. So it will take all of the variables that you put in and say, what is the best one for splitting? So the first split is often on an academic variable if you've thrown it in there. So high school GPA, or whether a student has transfer credits, something like that. And then after they've split that, they're like, okay, so for students who don't have transfer credits, what is the next thing that best splits that population into high and low retaining groups? So it kind of gets down to, and then you can see areas where, okay, overall students in this population retain lower, but under these circumstances, we actually find that they retain at higher rate.
I love that, because it is what you said, where so often we go to a campus and they're like, oh, we know athletes, like athletes are our most at-risk population, right? And then you run all of the data and analyze it and say, it's not athletes. It is athletes who play football, who came in with a high school GPA of this, who are this far from home and have this many credit hours, that they're taking right now. And the relief to a practitioner, where I'm not having to think of all my athletes as somebody that I have to resource, but instead you've given me this really specialized piece, I think is so helpful. And Viva, I always want to use that, especially I think for faculty who can have some very uneducated opinions about who's at risk in their classroom, and being able to say, like, actually, that's not true. This is actually the kind of student that you need to be paying attention to, I think is so powerful. Mm-hmm. You talk about finding those most at-risk populations. Are there any surprising patterns that you've seen as you've helped schools identify the most at-risk populations for retention risk?
I think interesting always. So date of deposit, I think, is an interesting one. I don't know if that would be surprising, but students who deposit later, I think it's a indicator of institutional commitment, but sometimes also financial difficulty. So it can be, you can see students who applied early, but still they just like deposited super late in the day. So it's not just that they applied later, if there's a choice there. And I think it was surprising to see that alongside. So we had some clients where we would see consistently, this residence hall has low retention. And then talking to them, we ended up getting the data to say, oh, well, that's how you're filling your residence hall. All of the students who deposited later are ending up in that hall altogether. So students with lower institutional commitment. So res hall, not always necessarily that there's something like wrong going on with RAs or something in the residence hall, but it might just be how it's being filled.
Yeah, like let's not put everybody who's not sure they want to be at this school together on the same hall so they can all talk about how, like, I really wanted to go somewhere else, but then I didn't get in, so then I had to do this school, right? It's such a good example of using that data to then craft your interventions. Because what we would say, and in fact, part of what we do in our Spark meetings is your team kind of develops all of that data and delivers it to them. And then we say, okay, now as interventionalists, here's what we would suggest you do, right? You keep rooms open in the various res halls. So we're not filling our worst res hall last with all of the people who aren't sure, that we're actually then intertwining and building community in a really intentional way. So I love that. And that's exactly what Spark is about, right? How do we use that data to then be like, oh, here's what we're actually going to do to try to solve that. So that's great. Yeah, deposit date's interesting because I am pretty sure even when I worked at a school, I would have been like, I don't care, right? And then you're like, well, you should care about it. Super helpful. Okay, so Viva, I love when there's somebody who has like a whole education and experience in something that I don't know very much about. And then I'm like, well, how do you then take that data and decide what you're going to do for the student population? And you're like, oh, there's a whole theory around that I teach people about how to take this data and then like apply it to whatever the problem is you're trying to solve, right? So you talk about how important it is to really understand what the barriers are for a student before we just say, here's how we're going to solve that problem. And an example is, don't guess that the barrier is the res hall isn't nice when the barrier might be, we're talking about low institutional commitment and we can actually get at that. So can you talk more about the importance of understanding those barriers and this idea of a theory of change framework that can help our schools think better and more systemically about what those student barriers are?
Yeah. So I think that theory of changes are extremely helpful for thinking through. So they are theories of change in that they're theories of how you make positive change happen. So you start with a population that you're supporting and get as detailed as you can about that population. And you say, well, what are we trying to long-term achieve for them? And then you work backwards to say, okay, so what might be getting in the way of students reaching that outcome? So we often look at students who don't have transfer credits. And we want to long-term see them graduate and enter a career of their choice and be successful in it. And we'll say, okay, well, what are barriers that might stop them from being able to get there? And so you kind of workshop and think it through. It's really helpful if you've done a needs analysis at this point. So to think what research already exists about that population that we can draw on. So what do we know already from what research exists? But then also there might be stuff out of like that original analysis that I might do to say, oh, well, it seems to be students specifically without transfer credits with these additional factors on our campus. But then also, doing surveys with the population to just really kind of understand as much as you can. But you can also at this point maybe make assumptions of what, just be, really call it out if it is an assumption. And then you turn it around and turn it into a positive. So students who are coming into college without any AP or dual credits, they might feel overwhelmed by the rigor of a college level course. And they might feel that they're behind other students and that they don't belong because they're looking at other people who do have credits and they're like, I'm so far behind. So then you turn that in to say, okay, they're feeling overwhelmed. So we want them to have the time management and study skills needed to be successful in college level courses. We want them to feel confident that they can succeed in all of their classes. We want them to feel a stronger sense of belonging. And then you'd have longer term, and ultimately we want them to have a GPA of a certain level. So you kind of break that all down. And you haven't thought at this point, what are we doing to solve it? It's just what are all of the things that might be in the way? And then you go, okay, what are we actually doing? And why do we think that they actually are going to lead to that outcome?
Yeah.
So you really have to articulate at every point, why is this going to happen? And where have I made an assumption? Because you need to be able to come back and test that at some point if you have made any.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much meat in what you just said. The first thing it makes me think of when you're talking about student surveys is, we're always preaching about not making assumptions about a student's story. You can see the outcome and you can see what those barriers are, but you do have to talk to them to understand why. Our example is always about academic recovery, right? And you just have a rule that if you didn't get a GPA of whatever last semester, then you've got to go to tutoring. And it's so insulting because you've assumed the barrier without talking to the student and understanding they've got all this life-changing going on. And it's one of the reasons why I think the connection piece, I mean, a lot of times we can't solve the actual problem, but we can be close enough to the student that we have good conversations with them about the wrestling and the barrier that they have so that we can better understand it. And maybe in all of those barriers, we can identify 3 or 4 that we actually can address using a specific intervention, but we won't be able to know that unless we're really close to the student. So I think it's a good reminder for us to be present with our students, and that you can have a hypothesis as long as you're really disciplined to be like, hey, I've got to check this out. But the other thing, Viva, that you're saying that, and it makes me think of, I've been reading a lot about how important it is to be able to accurately articulate how you feel. Because when you can accurately articulate how you feel, your solution is going to look different depending on how good you are at saying. So like if you're having a bad day at work and you're like, I think I feel stressed. Well, then maybe the right option is to quit. Like maybe the job's too stressful and it's terrible, right? But maybe if you then articulate like, no, it's not stress. I feel anxious because I have this big project that I've got to present. And so then the solution will be, you should practice your presentation because then you're going to mitigate that anxiety. It's a great example of the more granular and the more accurate you can get in your guess about the barrier that a student has, the better you'll be able to kind of come up with what are we going to do to be able to address that. So I think that's so important. This idea of needs analysis, I think what you're saying is that it helps us move past that assumption stage and really get to the meat of what is true for the student.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the difference, because this is, I think, especially for our listeners, a hard thing to nail down. The difference between outputs and outcomes in student success work. What is the difference and why is that important for us to know?
So it's important because you want to be able to know when you're looking back, you've done an intervention and you want to know if it's successful. It's really important to be able to pinpoint, was it something in our activity or is it something in the like theory of how we think the change happened that went wrong, I think. So your outputs are all of the things you're actually doing and the ways that you measure that. So if you're running tutoring sessions, how are you engaging students? You might have like all of the emails out, but then also the actual sessions that you're running. It's just like anything that measures the actual work that you are doing. And I think this gets conflated a lot where people will count those things and think that those are the outcomes. But at the end of the day, those are just, you could run those things and it could not, it's possible it wouldn't create any change. So outcomes are the actual positive change that has happened as a result of the work that you have done.
So let me restate that to you and then you tell me if I have it right, because I'm not sure that I do. So I'm thinking about what I always tell schools about resolution when they close the case, that I want the resolution to be really about your output. What did you do? You tried to contact the student, you had them come to your office, you met them in the hallway, whatever those things are. I want resolutions to be a measurement of what you did. So you can say, I engaged the student, or I never did engage the student, or whatever, right? And then your outcomes would be, did the student pass the class? Did they come back the next semester? And the combination of what you did and the effect that it had is really what we're talking about there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. So both are important, which I think is so good to say for practitioners, that I think sometimes you can make an error when you leave out one or the other. Yeah. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, I think it's just, so I think we had a client at one point, they were interested in the efficacy of these check-in sessions that they were running. They'd identified students as having either academic or financial risk factors, and they reached out to them and invited them to these check-in sessions. And they were like, we want to know if the check-in sessions were effective. And I think through doing analysis, I was like, well, I can see so many students were contacted to come and that very few students showed up. So the impact is lower than you probably expected, and it's not a reflection of that. If they came, the outcome was strong, but it's just kind of, it broke down at the stage of actually getting them to attend in the first place. So I guess that comes back to the success funnel a bit of the, like, is a connect issue rather than a solve issue, particularly for students who had the financial risk factors. Whatever they'd received, they were like, I don't want to be a part of that.
Yeah, and it's so hard because it's like, we really do need, I don't know, Viva. I mean, I want for everybody to tell the story about how hard our practitioners work. They work so freaking hard sometimes. Like, there's so much effort put into those things. But at some point, we do have to say, either here is actually what the outcome was, and isn't that amazing? And your work paid off, and you should keep doing it, and you should tell your story of that. Or we have to say, wow, you exerted a lot of effort, and it wasn't the right kind of effort because you didn't get down to the kind of outcome that you really wanted to have. I think it's very hard for people who are so focused on doing work to then take a step back and be like, what is this outcome measurement that tells us whether or not that was really successful? So, I think all the time about, meeting with our clients who are like, you just want to say, I see that you have worked so hard, and yet I know it doesn't have the kind of impact that you hope for because you weren't reaching the right students. The way you were talking to them was not compelling to them. You never got them in your office to be able to talk, right? So I think it's a really important thing for practitioners to be able to drill down into the difference between those things. So when you think about, obviously we're going to measure retention, right? That's the end goal. We think about student success and retention. But when you're thinking about measuring impact beyond standard retention, how would you counsel a school to think about that impact that they're making on a student population?
So I think if you go through the process and you create a theory of change and you have kind of the ways that you think that you're making impact, then you have a theory, you have your hypothesis. I think you want to start collecting data along every point that you can in that process. So if you're in the dog story with their, they have these sessions and they thought it would help reduce anxiety. So they measured that at the start and at the end. Like they had forethought to do that rather than at the end be like, that was fun.
I hope that worked. Don't y'all feel better? Right. Yeah, I love a pre-test and post-test because I feel like most of the time, if you've been intentional with your intervention, you are going to get great data around that. And it also really helps you, again, clearly and specifically articulate, what are we trying to impact? How do we do that? And then what is that going to look like when we're done? So I love a good pre-test and post-test. When I was doing career stuff, I would do pre and post-test on career self-efficacy. I knew what the measurements were. I talked about those specific things when I was doing my classes. And then lo and behold, their post-tests were always great. And I got to tell everyone, like, I said, this is what it's going to do. And here it is. I don't know, Viva, do you have an opinion about how I think sometimes people feel like it has to be a very sophisticated measurement process, which I think a lot of our schools outsource to you, right? To be like, yeah, you have some really great tools on how to do that. But is it fair to say, like, pick a thing and measure it and then continue to refine that? Are you allowed to do that?
Yeah, I definitely think you can. I worked at a pretty big charity here, and it was all about helping young people gain the confidence and skills to be successful in a job. But a lot of it was testing soft skills. And it was a pretty standard out of 5, how do you think that you are at time management type question. And then they would just they'd ask them at the start, and then I think a week or 2 later to be like, do you want to change what you said at the start and you know a bit more about this topic? And then they would ask them at the very end, now how do you feel?
I like that.
Pretty simple.
Yeah, because it's like, you don't even know how much you don't know. So you think you're amazing. And then we're like, really, do you do these 17 things? And they're like, I want to go back and change that to a 30. That's awesome. Yeah, I think I want to make a distinction, because there are very sophisticated ways for us to measure things, right? And that's your expertise and your job. And it's why people use Spark and use Focus to be able to do that. And then I think there's just telling your story and continuing to tweak that, even if you don't get it right the first time, right? Even if it's not perfect the first time, but picking a thing and measuring it then allows you to have some more robust understanding than you do if you don't do any of those kind of measurements. So I think there's some low-hanging fruit there for people just to be like, yeah, I just want to see if this is making a difference in this particular thing. You know, Matt has a great story about when he first came to our alma mater, like advising satisfaction was really, really low. And so he's like, here's the 5 things that you've got to get good at. And we're going to do a survey afterwards. And then I'm going to be able to say, we are reliable. You do give assurance. You are empathetic. That allows somebody to tell the story more specifically than if they weren't doing any measurement. So I think most of the time, some measurement is better than non-measurement, although some people are very bad at even rudimentary measurements. So you have to be careful. All right. I think my concluding question for you is about schools where, when I'm talking to them about Spark and I'm trying to explain how important it is, their response to me might be about how they have IR on their campus, how it's easy to get at sort of what descriptive statistics about who their students are and what they look like and all of that. Can you just provide some insight on this idea between data that sits in a place versus what we're trying to deliver to our clients in Spark in terms of actionable data?
Yeah, so I think the difference is partly just on what the process was. So what questions were being asked when looking at the data. So I think for IR, it's a pretty like, we need to report these figures.
Yeah.
It's not an act of reflection so much. Whereas I think for our reports, we provide a summary to give a really detailed, here's what's most important to know. And it's all driven by the questions of who are the most at-risk students? Has this been consistent over time? Which populations, if retention is up or down, who was it up or down for? Can we pinpoint where we've been successful and where are areas where we still need to improve? So I think it's just being very intentional, I guess, about what you're trying to provide and what you're saying in the narrative.
Yeah, Viva. And I think the advantage that you and your team have is that is a practice skill that comes from experience, right? So it's like, how far down can we drill to get at the exact right population? And one of my favorite things is when you're talking to a school and they're like, well, why aren't you talking about gender? And you're like, I know you think it's gender. Gender is not the right question to be asking, right? I just don't think there's a substitute for all of your experience in asking exactly the right question to get down to what is a manageable population for us to be able to serve. And then, did what you thought you were doing have any measurable impact on your outcome? And gosh, we started really as an intervention company. That's really where we were focused. And as we've evolved under your leadership in retention intelligence, I just cannot imagine trying to be a practitioner without the kind of insights that you offer. I would be like, yeah, but it's not everybody. So can you just tell me exactly? And I always think it's funny because, so often when you deliver those reports, that the person who's in charge of intervention is like, I want names, right? I don't want to know it's just this population. I want you to tell me the names of the students who are most at risk, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to manage them. I think about Stacy Martin at Hardin Simmons. She's amazing at this. Like, I want the names, and then I'm going to keep track of them, and I'm going to make sure that we invest in the right way for them. So it's just such a powerful tool, I think, that you provide our schools. And I think the outcome of this conversation is that so many of our listeners are going to be like, yeah, I can't even start to do what Viva and her team does. We should get them to do it for us. It for sure is an expertise. So thank you so much for the way that you are relentless in trying to figure out what that population is, and then also help schools to think about what are the barriers and what are the ways that we can intervene. Any closing thoughts about retention intelligence?
I think I was just thinking there, yeah, you were saying about practitioners and using us. I think we do have also it's like we do this full time. I'm not, this is my way of supporting students.
Yeah.
So, and when people take that data and they do action it, like Stacy Martin, it is very rewarding to be able to see that come out in the data. So.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, Viva, because I think the heart of why you do what you do is really important. It is not just saying, here's who struggle, but you really do approach it with how do I give you the best tool so that you can find the right students? Because we do believe in student success. We do think it's really powerful. It is the reason we do what we do. And so being able to have the right data to find the right students, I think, is so just invaluable for sure for our school. So thank you so much for loving students as much as our listeners do. It is not always that you find someone who is remarkable at data and really interested in the actionable piece. So thank you for being relentless in that. And thanks for talking to me.
Thank you.
All right, guys. We'll be back. I think next week, actually, I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Sherry Woosley about intentionality. So join us for that. Otherwise, have a great day.